An old man walks into a Marine barracks poker game. The youngest player nudges his buddy and whispers, "Easy money tonight." 2 hours later, that same Marine is staring at an empty wallet, watching the old man push back his chair without having looked at his own cards a single time. "You touch your neck when you bluff," the old man says quietly to the corporal. "Your pupil dilated," he tells the sergeant. Then he returns every dollar he won and reveals the truth nobody saw coming. If you believe that true skill comes from understanding people, not just the game, type respect in the comments right now. Silas Whitmore was 73 years old the summer he moved into the small apartment just outside Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. The building was nothing special. A 3-story walk-up with peeling paint on the railings and air conditioning units that wheezed like asthmatic grandparents. Most of the residents were either elderly locals who'd lived there for decades or young military families saving money before their next PCS move. Silas fit somewhere in between these worlds, a quiet man who kept to himself, nodded politely to neighbors, and spent most of his mornings sitting on the small balcony with a cup of black coffee, watching the world move past without any apparent desire to join it. The apartment complex sat about 2 miles from the main gate of Camp Lejeune, close enough that Silas could hear the distant pop of rifle ranges on training days and see the convoys of vehicles heading in and out during exercises. He'd chosen this location deliberately, though nobody knew that. There was something comforting about being near Marines again, even if he never spoke to them, even if decades separated him from the young men and women who now wore the uniform. He felt a kinship with them that he couldn't quite explain and didn't try to. Some connections don't need words. His neighbors knew almost nothing about him. The landlord knew his rent check always arrived 3 days early. The mail carrier knew he received very little correspondence. The occasional letter from the VA, a few magazines about woodworking that he never seemed to read. The woman in the apartment below him knew he walked with a slight limp on rainy days, and that he always held the door for her when they crossed paths in the stairwell. That was the extent of Silas Whitmore's social footprint, a shadow of a man, polite but impenetrable, kind but unknowable. He wore the same rotation of clothes most days, khaki pants that had seen better decades, polo shirts in muted colors, and a baseball cap from a hardware store that had closed 15 years ago. His face was weathered like old leather left too long in the sun, lined with creases that suggested a lifetime of expressions he no longer made. His eyes were the only thing about him that seemed fully alive, pale blue, sharp as broken glass, constantly moving, constantly watching. People who made eye contact with Silas often looked away first without knowing why. There was something in that gaze that made them feel like they'd been read, catalogued, and filed away in some mental cabinet they'd never have access to. The truth was, they weren't wrong to feel that way. The Lakewood Apartments had a small community room on the ground floor that nobody used for its intended purpose anymore. The HOA had given up on hosting bingo nights and potlucks years ago. Instead, the room had become an informal gathering space for whoever wanted to use it. Sometimes it was kids doing homework after school. Sometimes it was older residents playing chess, and every Thursday night for the past several months, it had become the site of a poker game that drew Marines from the nearby base. The game had started small, just 3 young lance corporals who lived in the complex with their wives, looking for something to do on their nights off. Word spread the way it always does in military communities, through gym sessions and motor pool shifts and cigarette breaks. Within a few weeks, the Thursday night game had become something of an institution. Marines would show up around 1900, bringing beer and cash and stories from the week. They'd play until midnight or later, losing and winning $20 buy-ins, talking trash, building the kind of camaraderie that doesn't happen in formations or classrooms. The regulars included Corporal Danny Reeves, 22 years old, fresh off his first deployment and convinced he was God's gift to Texas Hold'em. There was Sergeant Marcus Thompson, 27, the senior man at the table and the one who kept the game from getting out of hand. Lance Corporal Julio Vasquez, 20, who talked more than he won and didn't seem to mind either way. Private First Class Kevin Park, 19, the youngest and quietest, who was still learning to bluff without looking like he was about to throw up. And Staff Sergeant William Bill Decker, 34, the only married man in the group, who showed up when his wife let him off the leash and played like a man trying to remember what freedom felt like. They were good Marines, all of them. Decent men who worked hard and trained harder and used Thursday nights to blow off steam. They weren't gambling addicts or troublemakers. They were just young guys doing what young guys have done since before cards were invented. Competing, bonding, proving themselves against each other in small ways that didn't involve actual combat. None of them had ever spoken to Silas Whitmore until the night everything changed. It was a Thursday in late August, the kind of humid North Carolina evening where the air felt like wet wool against your skin. Silas had taken his usual evening walk around the complex, moving slow, enjoying the sound of crickets and the distant laughter of children playing before bedtime. He was heading back to his apartment when he passed the community room and glanced through the window. The lights were on, and he could see the Marines gathered around a folding table, cards and chips scattered across the surface. Something stirred in him. A memory, maybe, or just curiosity. He hadn't played poker in years. Hadn't done much of anything in years, if he was being honest. His life had become a series of routines designed to pass time without incident. Wake up, coffee, walk, lunch, television, dinner, sleep, repeat. It was a life, technically. But watching those young men laugh and argue and slam chips on the table, Silas felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. He wanted to be part of something again. He almost kept walking, almost went back to his apartment and his television and his quiet existence. But his feet had other plans, and before he could talk himself out of it, he was opening the door to the community room. The conversation stopped like someone had hit a mute button. 5 pairs of eyes turned toward the doorway, taking in the old man with the hardware store cap and the pants that were probably older than some of them. Silas could see them processing his presence, trying to figure out what he wanted, whether he was going to complain about the noise or ask them to leave. "Evening," Silas said, his voice soft but steady. "Mind if I watch for a bit?" The Marines exchanged glances. It was Sergeant Thompson who answered, diplomatic as always. "It's a free country, sir. Pull up a chair if you want." Silas nodded and settled into a plastic chair against the wall, a few feet back from the table. He didn't say anything else, just sat there with his hands folded in his lap, watching the game resume. The Marines were self-conscious at first, lowering their voices, cleaning up their language. But old men in chairs have a way of becoming invisible if they stay quiet long enough, and within 20 minutes, they'd mostly forgotten he was there. Silas watched. That's all he did that first night, watched. He watched Corporal Reeves tap the table with his ring finger whenever he had a strong hand. He watched Lance Corporal Vasquez's breathing change when he was trying to run a bluff. He watched Private Park's left eyelid twitch almost imperceptibly when he was nervous. He watched Sergeant Thompson's jaw muscles tighten when he was holding back frustration. And he watched Staff Sergeant Decker lean slightly forward when he had something good and slightly backward when he didn't. They were all tells, unconscious physical signals that betrayed what a person was thinking, feeling, hiding. Most people had them. Most people didn't know they had them, and most people certainly didn't know how to read them in others. But Silas Whitmore wasn't most people. He left after an hour without saying goodbye, slipping out while they were arguing about a contested hand. He went back to his apartment and slept better than he had in months. The next Thursday, he showed up again. Same chair. Same quiet observation. This time, Corporal Reeves acknowledged him with a nod, and Lance Corporal Vasquez asked if he wanted a beer. Silas declined politely and continued watching. By the 3rd Thursday, they were used to him. By the 4th, they were starting to wonder about him. "So what's your deal, old-timer?" Vasquez asked during a break in the action. You just like watching other people have fun, or what? Silas smiled, the kind of small smile that didn't reach his eyes but wasn't unfriendly either. I used to play some poker back in the day. Nice to see it again. Used to play? Reeves perked up, sensing opportunity. What happened? Get cleaned out one too many times? Something like that, Silas said. Well, if you ever want to lose some money, you know where to find us. Reeves grinned and the other Marines laughed. Silas didn't respond. He just kept watching. It was the 5th Thursday when Staff Sergeant Decker made the invitation that would change everything. He'd had a rough week, marriage troubles, work stress, the usual grinding weight of military life. He was feeling magnanimous in that way people sometimes feel when they're a little drunk and looking for entertainment. Hey, Pops, Decker called out. You want in? We'll deal you in next hand. The table went quiet. The other Marines looked at each other with barely concealed amusement. This was going to be fun. Easy money. The old guy probably hadn't played cards since Truman was president. Silas hesitated, and in that hesitation, every Marine at the table saw what they wanted to see. Uncertainty, intimidation, the nervousness of an old man who was in over his head. It never occurred to any of them that they might be seeing something else entirely. I suppose I could play a few hands, Silas said finally. If you gentlemen don't mind taking money from an old man. Oh, we don't mind at all, Reeves said, practically rubbing his hands together. Have a seat. We'll be gentle. Silas shuffled over to the table and lowered himself into the empty chair between Vasquez and Park. He moved slowly, deliberately, like every motion required careful consideration. He fumbled with his wallet, pulling out a $20 bill that looked like it had been folded and unfolded 1,000 times. He placed it on the table with the careful precision of someone who was counting every dollar. The Marines exchanged knowing looks. This was going to be like taking candy from a baby. A very old baby. 20 gets you in, Thompson said, sliding a stack of chips across the table. You know the rules. Texas Hold'em, right? 2 cards down, 5 community cards, best 5-card hand wins? That's right. You sure you're up for this? Silas nodded slowly. I'll try to keep up. The first hand was dealt. Silas picked up his cards, glanced at them for maybe half a second, then set them face down on the table. He didn't touch them again for the rest of the hand. The Marines noticed this but didn't think much of it. Some players were superstitious about handling their cards too much. The betting went around the table. Silas called every bet, never raising, never folding. When the river card hit and it was time to show hands, Silas turned over a pair of 7s that beat Vasquez's ace-high and Reeves's failed straight draw. He'd won his first pot. Lucky, Reeves muttered. Must be, Silas agreed. The second hand played out almost identically. Silas looked at his cards for a split second, then ignored them completely. He called when others bet, checked when he could, and somehow ended up with the winning hand again, a flush that materialized on the river. Okay, that's some serious beginner's luck, Decker said, his smile starting to look a little forced. The third hand, the fourth, the fifth. Silas won them all. But it wasn't just that he was winning, it was how he was winning. He seemed to know exactly when to call and when to fold. He'd let big hands go without hesitation, seemingly unaware that he'd just mucked a full house. He'd push aggressively with hands that looked weak but turned out to be exactly good enough to win. And through it all, he never, not once, looked at his cards after that initial half-second glance. By the 10th hand, the mood at the table had shifted from amusement to confusion to something approaching concern. Silas had won 8 of the 10 hands. His chip stack had grown from $20 to nearly $200. The Marines were looking at each other with expressions that said, "What the hell is happening?" "Hold up," Sergeant Thompson said, putting up a hand. "Time out. What's going on here?" Silas looked at him with those pale blue eyes. "I'm playing poker, same as you." "No, you're not. You're not even looking at your cards. How are you winning without looking at your cards?" Silas was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was gentle, almost apologetic. "I don't need to look at my cards, Sergeant. I'm looking at all of you." The words hung in the air like smoke. Nobody moved. "What the hell does that mean?" Reeves demanded. Silas leaned back in his chair and folded his hands in his lap. For the first time all night, he looked completely relaxed, like a man who had been holding back and was finally about to let go. "It means I'm not playing the cards, Corporal. I'm playing the players. You want to know how I know when you're bluffing? You touch your neck." Silas mimicked the gesture, a brief brush of fingers against the throat. "Right there. Every time. You're not even aware you're doing it. It's a pacifying behavior, something humans do when they're anxious. When you have a strong hand, your hands stay on the table. When you're bluffing, your hand goes to your neck. I've seen you do it 43 times in 5 weeks. 43. And you're bluffing about 70% of those times." Reeves' face went pale. His hand had started to move toward his neck before he caught himself and forced it back down. Silas turned to Sergeant Thompson. "You're harder to read. You've got good discipline. Probably been in longer than the others. But your pupils dilate when you're excited about a hand. Not much. Maybe a millimeter. But I've been watching you, and I know what your baseline is. When your pupils expand, you've got something good. When they stay normal, you're working with average cards or worse." Thompson stared at him like he was seeing a ghost. "Staff Sergeant Decker." Silas shifted his attention. "You lean forward when you're strong and backward when you're weak. It's subtle, maybe an inch or two, but it's consistent. You've done it every single hand tonight. Your body wants to engage when you have something worth fighting for and retreat when you don't. You can't help it. It's instinct." Decker looked down at his own posture, suddenly aware of how he was sitting. "Vasquez, your breathing changes. You take shorter breaths when you're bluffing, longer ones when you're confident. It's anxiety response. Your body needs less oxygen when it's preparing for conflict, more when it feels safe." Silas's voice was calm, clinical, like a doctor delivering a diagnosis. "And Park, your left eyelid twitches when you're nervous. Just a little flutter, barely visible. But I've been watching you for weeks. I know exactly what that twitch means." Private Park reached up and touched his eyelid, suddenly self-conscious about a behavior he'd never known he had. The community room was silent. 5 Marines sat frozen around a folding table, staring at an old man who had just dismantled their entire perception of themselves. It wasn't anger they felt. Not yet. It was something closer to awe, mixed with a creeping sense of exposure, like they'd all been caught naked in the middle of the street. "How?" Thompson started, then stopped. He didn't know how to finish the question. "How do I know how to do this?" Silas smiled, and this time it reached his eyes. A sad smile, weighted with decades of something these young men couldn't begin to understand. "I was trained to do it. Spent 32 years doing it, and I was very, very good at it." "Trained?" Decker's voice was barely a whisper. "Trained by who?" Silas was quiet for a long moment. The distant sound of crickets filtered through the window. Somewhere outside, a car door slammed. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed, softer, older, carrying the weight of memories that most people never had to carry. "I enlisted in the Marine Corps in 1969, Paris Island, summer cycle. Hottest 3 months of my life, and I don't just mean the weather." He paused, letting the words sink in. "I was 18 years old, scared out of my mind, and convinced I was going to Vietnam. Turned out I was right about that. Got orders after SOI, shipped out 3 months later. Khe Sanh, then south. I was a rifleman, just like most of you probably started out." The Marines had gone completely still. This wasn't what they'd expected. This wasn't what anyone had expected. I did my tour, saw things, did things. Same story as a million other Marines, but somewhere along the way, somebody noticed something about me. I had a knack for getting people to talk. Prisoners, informants, locals, didn't matter. Put me in a room with someone and I could get them to tell me things they didn't want to tell me. I didn't even know I was doing anything special at the time. I just read people, listened to what they weren't saying, watched how they moved, how they breathed, where they looked. Silas reached up and removed his baseball cap, running a hand through thin gray hair. Without the cap, he looked older, more vulnerable, but his eyes stayed sharp. Someone put my name forward for a special program. Counterintelligence. They were looking for people who could spot lies, extract truth, detect deception without laying a hand on anyone. The physical stuff, that wasn't my department. Never was. I was about what you might call psychological engagement. Reading people. Understanding people. Breaking through their defenses without them even knowing I was doing it. Counterintelligence. Thompson repeated, like he was testing the word on his tongue. You mean like interrogation? Among other things. I spent the next 3 decades doing work I still can't talk about. Not won't, can't. Some of it's still classified. Probably will be until long after I'm dead. But I can tell you this. I've sat across from some of the most dangerous, most deceptive people on the planet. Spies, terrorists, double agents, people who had been trained their entire lives to lie, to deceive, to hide their true intentions. And I read them, every single one. I found the truth they were hiding, the secrets they thought were safe, the lies they thought were perfect. He picked up the stack of chips he'd won and looked at them thoughtfully. Poker tells are nothing compared to what I've seen. A neck touch, a pupil dilation, child's play. I've read micro-expressions in interrogations where the subject didn't move a single visible muscle. I've detected deception through respiratory patterns alone. I've known what someone was thinking before they knew it themselves. Silas set the chips back down. The human body is a broadcasting station that never stops transmitting. Most people just don't know how to tune into the signal. Vasquez found his voice first. So you've been sitting here for 5 weeks, watching us, reading us, learning our tells, just so you could hustle us at a poker game. Silas looked at him, and there was something in his expression that made Vasquez instantly regret the accusatory tone. It wasn't anger. It was sadness. No, son, that's not why I was watching you. Then why? Silas was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its clinical edge. He sounded for the first time like the old man he appeared to be. Because I miss it. Being around Marines. Being around young men who remind me of who I used to be. Being part of something instead of just existing next to it. He gestured at the room, the table, the chips, the cards. When I retired, I thought I'd be okay. I had money saved, a pension, a plan. What I didn't have was a purpose. Do you know what that feels like? To spend 3 decades being essential, being needed, being the man they called when everything else failed, and then to suddenly be nothing. To wake up one day and realize that nobody needs you anymore. That the skills you spent a lifetime developing are useless in the civilian world? The Marines shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't the direction any of them had expected the conversation to go. I've been alone for 7 years now. My wife Eleanor, she passed in 2017. Cancer. We never had kids. Career didn't allow for it. The job was everything. It had to be. And now the job is gone, and Eleanor's gone, and I'm just here, existing, watching life happen around me without being part of it. He picked up his cards from the last hand, a pair of 9s that had beaten Decker's king high. He looked at them for a long moment, then set them back down. Watching you boys play poker, it was the first time in years I felt alive. Not because of the game, I couldn't care less about winning or losing money, but because of what I could do, because I could still read people, because those skills I thought were useless, they're not. They're still there. All those years of training, all those operations, all those interrogations, they left something in me that doesn't go away, and for a few hours every Thursday night, I got to use it again. The room was silent. Even the crickets outside seemed to have quieted. I wasn't trying to hustle you, Silas continued. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I just wanted to feel like myself again. Even if it was just in a stupid poker game in a community room that smells like mildew. He laughed softly, a sound without much humor in it. I'm sorry if I embarrassed anyone. That wasn't my intention. I'll give your money back, all of it, and I'll stay away from your games from now on. I should have known better. He started to stand, reaching for his winnings to push them toward the center of the table. But before he could, Sergeant Thompson's voice cut through the silence. Sit down. Silas paused, half risen from his chair. Thompson was looking at him with an expression that was hard to read, which was saying something, considering what Silas had just revealed about his abilities. I said sit down, Thompson repeated, softer this time. Please. Silas slowly lowered himself back into the chair. The other Marines were watching their sergeant, waiting to see where this was going. Thompson leaned forward, his forearms on the table. My grandfather was in Korea, Chosin Reservoir. He never talked about it, not once, not ever. But I could tell it was always there, you know, behind his eyes, this weight he carried that none of us could understand. He died when I was 16, and I always regretted that I never got to hear his stories. Never got to understand what he went through. He paused. I'm not going to make that mistake again. He looked around at the other Marines, some kind of silent communication passing between them. Then he looked back at Silas. You're not going anywhere, and we're not taking our money back. What? Reeves looked confused. Sarge, he literally just admitted He admitted he's one of us, Thompson interrupted. Or was, anyway. 32 years? You know how many people make it to 32 years. You know what you have to go through to make it that long. He shook his head. I don't know exactly what this man did for the Corps, but I know enough about counterintelligence to know it wasn't easy, it wasn't safe, and it probably cost him more than any of us can imagine. Vasquez nodded slowly. My dad was intel. Never talked about his work either. But I saw what it did to him, the paranoia, the secrecy, the way he could never really relax even when he was home. It takes a toll, Silas admitted quietly. More than most people understand. Staff Sergeant Decker leaned back in his chair, consciously this time aware of what the motion meant. So all those weeks you were watching us, learning our tells, you weren't planning some big hustle. You were just being you. I was doing what I've always done, Silas said, reading the room. It's not something I can turn off. I see tells the way you see faces. It's just how my brain works now. Can't change it any more than I can change the color of my eyes. Can you teach it? Private Park asked suddenly. Everyone turned to look at the youngest Marine, who blushed but held his ground. I mean, if you can see all this stuff about us, can you teach us to see it too, or to hide our own tells? Silas considered the question. You want to learn to read people? I want to learn to not be readable, Park said. You said my eyelid twitches when I'm nervous. I've never been able to control that. In the field, something like that could get me killed, or get one of my buddies killed. If you could teach me how to suppress it, or even just be aware of it. Same here, Vasquez jumped in. If I'm broadcasting my emotional state through my breathing pattern, I need to know about it. We all do. The energy in the room had shifted again. What had started as a poker game, turned into a hustle, evolved into a confession, had now become something else entirely. Something that looked a lot like opportunity. You want me to train you? Silas asked, a note of disbelief in his voice. In interrogation techniques, behavioral analysis. "We want you to train us to be better," Thompson said simply. "Better at reading people, better at controlling ourselves, better at the psychological game that we all know is just as important as the physical one. You've got 3 decades of experience in exactly the kind of skills they don't teach at SOI. Why shouldn't we learn from you?" Silas was quiet for a long time. The Marines waited, watching the emotions play across his weathered face. Surprise, doubt, something that might have been hope. Finally, he spoke. "When I was at the farm, that's what we called the training facility, one of my instructors told me something I've never forgotten. He said that knowledge without transfer is just self-indulgence, that the whole point of learning anything is to pass it on to someone else. Otherwise, it dies with you." "So pass it on," Decker said. "Teach us, not to hustle poker games, to survive, to lead, to understand the people we're responsible for and the enemies we're up against." "It won't be easy," Silas warned. "The fundamentals take months to internalize, and unlearning your own tells is even harder than learning to read others. You'll have to confront things about yourselves you probably don't want to see." "We're Marines," Reeves said, and for the first time all night there was no bravado in his voice, just simple truth. "Hard is what we do." Silas looked around the table at each of them in turn. 5 young men in the prime of their lives, willing to learn from an old man they'd known for barely an hour. 5 Marines who had invited him into their game expecting an easy mark, and instead found a teacher. It wasn't how he'd imagined this night going. It wasn't how he'd imagined any of his remaining nights going, but maybe that was the point. Maybe you don't get to choose how your purpose finds you. Maybe you just have to be open to it when it does. "All right," Silas said finally. "We start next Thursday. Bring notebooks and forget everything you think you know about reading people. We're starting from scratch." What followed was one of the most remarkable unofficial training programs in the history of Camp Lejeune, though it would never appear in any official record or after-action report. The Thursday night poker games continued, but they transformed into something else entirely. Silas would deal hands that nobody played to completion, using them instead as teaching tools. He'd walked the Marines through each decision point, explaining what tells they were showing and what tells they should be looking for. He'd pause the action to have them analyze each other's micro-expressions, their posture shifts, their breathing patterns. "The face has 43 muscles," Silas explained during one early session, "each one capable of independent movement. When someone experiences a genuine emotion, certain muscles fire automatically. We call these involuntary expressions. When someone tries to fake an emotion, they typically only engage the muscles they can consciously control. Learn to spot the difference, and you'll never be deceived by a false smile again." He taught them about baseline behavior, the importance of observing someone in a neutral state before trying to detect deception. "Everyone's different," he emphasized. "Some people naturally avoid eye contact. Some people naturally touch their faces when they talk. If you don't know what's normal for a specific individual, you'll misread their signals constantly." He taught them about stress tells, the physical manifestations of psychological pressure. When humans are stressed, blood flow decreases to the extremities. That's why interrogators watch the hands. If someone's fingers are paler than usual, they're under pressure. If they're redder, blood is flowing freely. They're relaxed, confident, possibly even enjoying the interaction. He taught them about the feet. People watch the face and hands, but they forget about the feet. The feet are the most honest part of the body. When someone's feet are pointed toward the door, they want to leave, no matter what their mouth is saying. When their feet are pointed toward you and firmly planted, they're engaged. Trust the feet. They'll tell you what the face is trying to hide. He taught them about speech patterns. Verbal tells are just as important as physical ones. People who are lying tend to use fewer first-person pronouns. They distance themselves from the deception. They over-explain and over-qualify. They give too much detail about irrelevant things and not enough about crucial things. They repeat questions back to buy time. Listen for the words as much as you watch for the movements. The Marines were eager students. Reeves, for all his earlier cockiness, turned out to have a natural gift for reading micro-expressions. Thompson's analytical mind made him excellent at identifying patterns over time. Vasquez's social intelligence helped him understand the emotional context behind different tells. Park, the quietest of the group, became their best baseline reader. He noticed things about people that even Silas had missed. Decker took a different approach. More interested in controlling his own tells than reading others, he became Silas's project in what they started calling operational invisibility, the ability to present a neutral, unreadable exterior regardless of internal state. The key is managing your own arousal level, Silas explained during one of their sessions. Your body reacts to your emotional state automatically. If you want to control the external signals, you have to learn to control the internal state. That means breathing techniques, mental exercises, ways of regulating your own stress response so your body doesn't broadcast it to the world. He taught them the techniques he'd learned over decades: controlled breathing patterns, grounding exercises, cognitive reframing strategies. He showed them how to lower their heart rate through visualization, how to relax specific muscle groups on command, how to maintain steady eye contact without triggering their own discomfort responses. In an interrogation setting, the subject is always trying to read you just as much as you're trying to read them, Silas said. If they can see that you're anxious, frustrated, or uncertain, they'll use it against you. Your job is to be a mirror that reflects nothing or reflects exactly what you want them to see. The training expanded beyond Thursday nights. Marines would text Silas observations they'd made during the week, tells they'd spotted in their commands, deception patterns they'd noticed in routine interactions. He'd respond with feedback, corrections, additional lessons. It became a running dialogue, a constant seminar in human behavior that infiltrated their daily lives. "You're changing how we see the world," Vasquez told him one night. "I can't turn it off anymore. I see tells everywhere, at the PX, at the gym, in briefings. It's like learning a new language and suddenly realizing everyone around you has been speaking it the whole time." "That's exactly what it's like," Silas agreed. "And just like learning a language, it becomes automatic. Eventually you won't have to think about it. You'll just know, the way you know what someone means by their tone of voice without consciously analyzing it. Reading people will become as natural as reading text." But the training wasn't just technical. Over the weeks and months that followed, Silas found himself sharing more and more of his past, not the classified details, but the human ones. The toll the work had taken on him, the relationships he'd sacrificed, the nights he'd lain awake wondering if he was doing the right thing, if the information he extracted was worth the methods he used to get it, if the enemies he understood so deeply had started to understand him in return. "The hardest part of this job isn't reading other people," he told them during one late-night session. "It's keeping yourself readable. When you spend years learning to see through deception, you start to see deception everywhere. In your friends, your family, your own reflection. You become paranoid, cynical, unable to trust. The skills that make you valuable in the field can destroy you everywhere else." "How do you keep it from destroying you?" Thompson asked. Silas was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know that I have. I lost my wife to the job as much as I lost her to cancer. I was away so much, and even when I was home, part of me wasn't there. She used to say she could see when I was reading her, analyzing her instead of just being with her. She hated it, and I couldn't stop, didn't know how to stop." The room was heavy with the weight of his confession. "These skills I'm teaching you, they're powerful. More powerful than you probably realize right now. But power has a cost. The cost is intimacy. The cost is the ability to be truly present with another person without your training getting in the way. I want you to be good at this. I want you to use these skills to save lives, to complete missions, to be the best Marines you can be. But I also want you to know the price. and I want you to decide for yourselves whether it's worth paying." It was Reeves who broke the silence. The cockiest of them, the one who'd been most eager to exploit the skills for personal advantage. His voice was different now, older somehow. "You said knowledge without transfer is just self-indulgence, that the point of learning is to pass it on. Well, maybe there's another side to that. Maybe the point of passing it on is also to process it, to make sense of what you've been through by helping someone else through it. Maybe that's what this has been for you." Silas looked at him, surprised. The young man he'd dismissed as a hustler and a show-off was revealing depths he hadn't expected. "Maybe it has been," Silas admitted. "I hadn't thought about it that way, but maybe you're right." "Then keep teaching," Reeves said. "Not because we need to learn, though we do, but because you need to teach. You need a purpose, and you've found one. Don't walk away from it just because the cost has been high. Walk toward it because the cost makes it matter." The words hung in the air like something sacred. Silas felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of a knot he hadn't known was there. For years, he'd carried the weight of his expertise like a burden, a skill set that had outlived its usefulness. Now, for the first time, he saw it as a gift, something worth giving away. "When did you get so wise?" Silas asked, a hint of genuine wonder in his voice. Reeves grinned, that same cocky grin he'd worn the night they first met. But there was something different behind it now, something earned. "I had a good teacher." The months rolled on. Summer turned to fall, fall to winter, winter to spring. The Thursday night sessions continued, but they'd expanded to include other nights as well. Word had spread through the base, quietly, carefully, in the way that matters in military communities. Other Marines started appearing at the games, recommended by Reeves or Thompson or one of the original 5. Silas vetted each one carefully, watching them for weeks before making a decision about whether to bring them into the inner circle. "Why so selective?" Vasquez asked once. "If these skills are so valuable, shouldn't we be teaching as many people as possible?" "Some people aren't ready," Silas explained. "Some people would use these skills to manipulate, to deceive, to gain advantage at others' expense. I've seen it happen. Talented interrogators who cross the line, who use their abilities for personal gain or to hurt people who didn't deserve it. I won't create weapons like that. I'll only train people who understand the responsibility that comes with this kind of power." The original 5 had become his quality control. They'd observe new candidates, discuss them privately, reach consensus before anyone was invited to participate. It was rigorous, perhaps overly so. But Silas knew from experience that skills taught to the wrong person could do tremendous damage. Not everyone who trained with Silas stayed at Lejeune. Marines PCS'd, deployed, eased out. But the skills they'd learned went with them. Thompson made gunnery sergeant and transferred to a training battalion where he quietly incorporated behavioral analysis into his curriculum. Decker retired and took a job with a private security firm, where his interrogation skills proved invaluable. Park went to officer candidate school and was commissioned, carrying his training into the officer corps. Reeves stayed local, eventually becoming one of Silas's assistant instructors. He had a gift for teaching that even Silas hadn't anticipated, able to break down complex concepts into digestible pieces, to relate to younger Marines in ways that Silas sometimes couldn't. "You know," Reeves told him one night, "when I first saw you walk into that community room, I thought you were just a lonely old man looking for company. I figured I'd clean you out at cards and maybe feel a little guilty about it afterward." "And now?" Reeves laughed. "Now I realize you were the one reading us the whole time. You saw something in us before we saw it in ourselves. Some potential, some capacity for learning that we didn't know we had. You weren't looking for company. You were looking for students. You just didn't know it yet." "I wasn't," Silas protested mildly. "I really was just lonely." "Maybe. But loneliness led you to watch us. Watching us led you to understand us. Understanding us led you to teach us, and teaching us gave you purpose again. Sometimes the path forward isn't the one you planned. Sometimes it's the one that finds you when you're not looking. It was a profound observation from a young man who'd once measured his worth in poker pots. Silas felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with his own accomplishments. "When did I become the student?" he asked, half joking. "You've always been the student," Reeves replied. "The best teachers are. They never stop learning, even when they're the ones at the front of the room. That's what makes them great." Silas thought about that for a long time after Reeves left. The young corporal, soon to be sergeant by all accounts, was right. The best interrogators Silas had known were perpetually curious, always seeking new patterns, new tells, new ways of understanding the infinitely complex machinery of human behavior. The day you thought you knew everything was the day you started missing things. He'd started this journey as a lonely old man with skills nobody needed. He was ending it, or continuing it rather, as something else entirely. A teacher, a mentor, a bridge between generations of Marines. His purpose hadn't come from the Marine Corps or from any official assignment. It had come from 5 young men in a community room playing poker on a Thursday night, open to seeing an old man as something more than he appeared. Maybe that was the real lesson. Not the tells or the techniques or the careful art of reading human behavior, but the importance of being willing to be read yourself, to let people in, to show them the truth behind the face you present to the world. Silas had spent 30 years perfecting the art of inscrutability. He'd learned to present a neutral mask that gave nothing away, to control every signal his body might send, to be unreadable even to experts. It had served him well in interrogation rooms and hostile territory, but it had failed him everywhere else. These young Marines had cracked his mask without even trying. They'd seen the loneliness behind his eyes, the need for purpose behind his quiet observation, the hunger for connection behind his careful distance. They'd read him, not because they were trained to, but because they were human. And in reading him, they'd shown him what he'd been missing all along. The best interrogation happens when both parties learn something. The best teaching happens when the teacher is transformed as much as the student. The best connection happens when 2 people are willing to be truly seen by each other, without masks, without tells, without anything to hide. Silas Whitmore walked into a poker game looking for a way to feel alive again. He found something better. He found a way to pass on everything he knew to people who would use it well. He found a way to matter again, not through classified operations or secret missions, but through the simple act of sharing knowledge with young men who are hungry to learn. And he found a family, not the family he'd sacrificed decades ago, not the children he'd never had, but something close, something real. 5 Marines, and then 10, and then more, who looked at him not as a relic of a bygone era, but as a mentor, a guide, a man worth learning from. The stack of money still sat on the table from that first night, the winnings Silas had offered to return, that Thompson had refused to take back. They'd never resolved what to do with it. Eventually, Silas used it to buy a better set of chips, a proper poker table, comfortable chairs for the community room. The money that had started as easy marks became the foundation of something meaningful. Sometimes, late at night, when the lessons were done and the Marines had gone home, Silas would sit alone in that room and think about all the interrogations he'd conducted over 30 years. All the secrets he'd extracted, the lies he'd unraveled, the truths he'd forced into the light. He'd been proud of that work once. It had served his country, protected American lives, brought enemies to justice. But sitting there, in a room that smelled slightly less like mildew now, surrounded by the echoes of young voices learning ancient skills, he realized something. This was better. Not because the work was more important, not because the stakes were higher, but because this was human. This was connection. This was the thing he'd sacrificed in his pursuit of professional excellence, now returned to him in the twilight of his life. He'd hustled the Marines at poker. That part was true, but they'd hustled him right back. They'd taken an old man who'd lost his purpose and given him a new one. They'd taken a master interrogator and reminded him that the most important truths aren't extracted. They're shared. They'd taken a lonely veteran and made him part of something again. If you'd asked Silas Whitmore what he wanted out of life when he moved into that apartment outside Camp Lejeune, he wouldn't have had an answer. He was just existing, waiting for whatever came next, assuming whatever came next would be more of the same nothing he'd grown used to. He never could have predicted Thursday night poker. He never could have predicted 5 young Marines willing to see past his appearance to the man underneath. He never could have predicted finding purpose in teaching, meaning in mentorship, family and fellowship. But that's the thing about life. The best parts are usually the ones you never see coming. 3 years later, Silas Whitmore passed away peacefully in his sleep. He was 76 years old. The doctors said it was his heart, worn out finally after decades of stress and service. But the Marines who'd known him said it was something else. They said his heart was fuller than it had been in years. They said he died with a purpose fulfilled, a legacy secured, a life completed in a way he never expected. The funeral at Camp Lejeune was standing room only. Marines from across the country flew in to pay their respects, some who'd trained with Silas directly, others who'd learned from people he'd taught, a chain of knowledge extending outward like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. There were generals and privates, officers and enlisted, active duty and retired. They came because word had spread, as it always does in the military, about the old man who could read anyone and who chose to use that gift to make others better. Sergeant Marcus Thompson, now gunnery sergeant, delivered the eulogy. He told the story of that first poker game, of an old man who looked like easy money and turned out to be the hardest teacher they'd ever had. He talked about the lessons Silas had imparted, not just about reading people, but about being read, about vulnerability and connection, about purpose and meaning, about the importance of passing on what you know to people who will use it well. He used to say that knowledge without transfer is just self-indulgence, Thompson said, his voice steady despite the emotion beneath. But I think he had it backward. I think for Silas, transfer without knowledge was impossible. He couldn't help teaching, couldn't help sharing what he knew, couldn't help making everyone around him better. It wasn't self-indulgence that drove him, it was generosity. A generosity of spirit that he'd kept hidden for too long, until 5 dumb Marines invited him to a poker game and accidentally set it free. There was laughter at that, wet-eyed laughter, the kind that comes when grief and joy mixed together into something that doesn't have a name. I don't know how many people Silas Whitmore interrogated over his career. I don't know how many secrets he extracted or how many enemies he defeated. That information is probably still classified, and it'll probably stay that way, but I know this. The people in this room, the Marines he taught in that little community room, the students of his students spreading out across the Corps. That's his real legacy. Not the operations or the medals or the classified citations. Us. What we learned. What we'll teach others. What will live on long after today. The Marine Corps band played Eternal Father, Strong to Save. Taps echoed across the cemetery. A rifle salute cracked the morning air, and then it was done. Afterward, in the community room that had become a kind of shrine, the original 5 gathered one last time around the poker table Silas had bought with his winnings. They dealt a hand that nobody played, letting the cards sit face down while they remembered. "You know what I keep thinking about?" Reeves said. He'd made sergeant now, was being discussed for staff sergeant. That first night. How confident we were that we were going to take his money, how sure we were that we knew exactly who he was. We were idiots, Vasquez agreed. He was out now, using his skills in the private sector, but he'd flown back for the funeral. We were young, Thompson corrected. We judged by appearance because that's what humans do. Silas taught us to look deeper. He also taught us to forgive ourselves for the looking that we did before we knew better. He taught us a lot of things, Park said quietly. Lieutenant Park now, leading a platoon of his own. But I think the biggest thing he taught me was that it's never too late. Never too late to find purpose. Never too late to connect with people. Never too late to matter. Decker, retired now, working private security, nodded. He was 73 when we met him. Most people that age are just running out the clock. He found a whole new reason to live in a poker game with a bunch of 20-something Marines. If that's not inspirational, I don't know what is. They sat in silence for a while, each lost in their own memories. The cards stayed unplayed. The chips stayed stacked. The room that had seen so much learning, so much growth, so much transformation, held its peace. Finally, Thompson spoke. "So what do we do now? How do we honor what he built?" It was Reeves who answered. "We do what he did. We find the next Silas, the next lonely veteran sitting on the sidelines, watching life happen around them, wishing they could be part of it again. We invite them in. We let them teach us whatever they know. We give them the purpose they need, the same way we gave it to him. And we keep teaching," Vasquez added. "Everyone we trained, everyone we'll train, everyone they'll train. The chain doesn't break just because the first link is gone. It keeps going. That's how legacies work." Thompson nodded slowly. He'd like that. Silas would like that. "He'd probably say we're being too sentimental," Park observed with a small smile. "He'd tell us to deal the cards and stop navel-gazing." "Yeah," Reeves agreed, a grin breaking through his grief. "He probably would." So they dealt the cards. They played a few hands, just like old times, calling out each other's tells with the fluency of experts, laughing at how obvious they still were despite years of training. It wasn't a memorial. It was a continuation, a demonstration that what Silas had built would outlive him. The community room in the Lakewood apartment still hosts a poker game every Thursday night. Different Marines now, younger ones who never met the old man who started it all. But they've heard the stories. They know about Silas Whitmore, the counterintelligence legend who spent his last years teaching Marines to read people like he did. They know about the tells and the techniques and the hard-won wisdom he passed down. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the cards are dealt and the lessons flow, they could swear they feel something watching them. Not judging, not analyzing, just watching. With approval. With pride. With the satisfaction of a teacher who knows his students will carry on. Because an old man walked into a poker game one Thursday night, and 5 young Marines learned that the greatest tells aren't in the cards. They're in the people holding them, and the greatest lesson isn't how to win, it's how to see.